The autumn of 1980 should have been the beginning of a steady future for 22-year-old Kevin Dundon. He was from Clacton-on-Sea, a small seaside town in Essex, England, where life was predictable, but opportunities were limited. Kevin was the kind of young man people remembered for his warmth and good humor. Friends described him as easygoing, someone who could make a room lighter just by walking into it. He enjoyed photography, music, and nights at the pub, but beneath his carefree image, he was searching for a sense of direction. That search led him to Townsend Thoresen, the well-known ferry company operating cross-channel voyages. For a man in his early 20s, the promise of stable employment, travel, and camaraderie with fellow crew members seemed like a step toward adulthood. When he signed on to the Viking Viscount, one of the company's roll-on, roll-off ferries, he had only been working there for 3 days. He was still learning the routines, still adjusting to life at sea, and still a newcomer to the tight social circles that formed among the crew. The Viking Viscount was a busy vessel, running a regular line between Felixstowe in Suffolk and Zeebrugge in Belgium. These were not glamorous cruises, but essential lifelines of trade and transport. The ferries carried cars, lorries, and holidaymakers, with a crew responsible for everything from food service to navigation. Kevin was assigned to the galley, the kitchen where meals for staff and passengers were prepared. For a new recruit, it was hard work but straightforward, keeping up with the endless stream of trays, dishes, and supplies, and ensuring the rhythm of service never faltered. On Sunday, September 21st, 1980, the Viking Viscount left Zeebrugge on its return voyage to England. It was an ordinary crossing, routine for the crew, forgettable for the passengers. To Kevin's family, however, this day would come to define the rest of their lives. As the ship sailed across the North Sea, Kevin worked his assigned shift in the galley. The last confirmed sighting of him came sometime between 6 and 6:30 in the evening. Witnesses recalled him leaving the plate room, stepping through a door that led either to the toilets or onto the outer deck. It was a small, ordinary action, the kind of thing no one paid attention to in the moment. But within minutes, it became the pivot point of an enduring mystery. That door's placement mattered. If Kevin went one way, he entered the toilets, shielded from view, and could have returned to his duties without anyone noticing the detour. If he went the other, he stepped outside into the open air, onto the steel decks where the sea wind cut sharp and the waves struck cold. In the fading light of evening, the North Sea stretched endless and merciless. If he lingered too close to the rails, a slip or misstep could be fatal. The distinction should have been clear, but no one could say with certainty which path he chose. When his absence was first noticed, there was no alarm. On a ship bustling with passengers, cargo, and crew, it wasn't unusual for a young man to take a short break, to vanish into a side room or find a quiet spot. The expectation was that he would return in a few minutes, resume his work, and laugh it off. But as time stretched on, unease grew. Colleagues began to ask where Kevin was. His station remained empty. The hours of the voyage pushed forward, and what started as a casual absence began to take on weight. For Kevin's family back in Clacton-on-Sea, the day was unremarkable. They had no idea that his name was already moving toward police records, that the questions of his whereabouts were echoing across the ferry's narrow corridors. To them, he was simply at work, building a life, earning wages, and carving out his path in adulthood. They would only learn later that somewhere in the routine of that evening crossing, their son, brother, and friend had taken a step from which he would never return. By the time the Viking Viscount approached England, Kevin Dundon had effectively vanished. He was last seen walking out of the galley through a door, and beyond that moment, no trace of him exists. No passenger recalled a confrontation, no colleague remembered unusual behavior, and no one reported witnessing a fall overboard. His disappearance was not marked by drama or commotion, only by silence. A silence that grew heavier with every passing hour. That final ordinary action, stepping through a doorway, became the last definitive point in Kevin's story. Whether it led him into the anonymity of the ship's internal passageways or out into the dark vastness of the sea remains the unanswered question. And in that uncertainty lies the chilling beginning of a case that remains unsolved over 4 decades later. You're watching Trace of Evil, where we reveal true crimes, unsolved disappearances, and mysteries surrounding crime. Like and subscribe to watch more episodes from our channel. Let's get back into the story of Kevin Dundon. As the Viking Viscount pushed through the choppy waters of the North Sea, Kevin Dundon's absence stretched from minutes into hours. The ship's routine depended on discipline. Staff rotated through their duties with little margin for error. When a crew member failed to return, colleagues noticed. By early evening, murmurs of concern replaced the casual assumption that Kevin had simply stepped away. His station in the galley remained unattended, an empty place in a workplace where no one was meant to disappear. Around 6:30, the ship's internal announcements carried his name. It was a precautionary measure, the kind used when someone was thought to be temporarily missing but still on board. Passengers and crew were asked to look out for him, to report if they saw him wandering corridors or sitting quietly in one of the public areas. Such announcements rarely carried dread. More often than not, they brought someone back sheepishly, embarrassed at having caused a fuss. But this time, no one answered. Crew members began a systematic search of the ferry. They checked the toilets, the stairwells, the dining areas, and the narrow crew corridors that snaked through the vessel. They expected to find Kevin somewhere obvious, perhaps unwell, perhaps avoiding his duties, perhaps asleep in an unused corner. But the compartments came up empty. Passengers were asked quietly if they had seen him, and a few shrugged, uncertain, unsure of names or faces. The Viking Viscount carried enough travelers that one young man in uniform could easily blur into the background. The real problem lay in the ambiguity of that final doorway. If Kevin had turned left into the toilets, he should have emerged within minutes. But if he had gone straight through onto the deck, the possibilities grew darker. The September evening brought fading light and stiff winds. Out there, the sound of the sea drowned conversation, and the rhythm of the ship's machinery masked anything short of a shout. A lone crewman could vanish into that environment without attracting notice. By the time the ferry neared Felixstowe, worry had hardened into something closer to fear. The captain was informed. The announcement system repeated Kevin's name. Still, there was no sign of him. What was supposed to be a routine shift ended with silence where a young man should have been. When the Viking Viscount finally docked, Kevin's absence could no longer be ignored. The gangways lowered, passengers disembarked, and the crew remained under instruction. A full onboard search commenced. Every cabin, every storage space, every compartment that could conceivably hold a person was checked. Yet there was nothing. Kevin Dundon was not on the ship. The possibility that he had gone overboard could not be dismissed. The Coast Guard was alerted. In those first critical hours after docking, a man-overboard response was initiated, with lifeboats and helicopters combing the waters along the ferry's route. Search patterns expanded outward, tracking currents and estimating drift. The sea yielded no body, no floating clothing, no evidence at all. What unsettled investigators most was the absence of any witness accounts. On a ship with over 200 people aboard, no one reported seeing Kevin on the outer deck. No one heard a splash. No one saw a figure near the railings. No one described a struggle. If he had slipped or fallen, it seemed remarkable that not a single passenger or crew member had noticed. The silence extended to his personal belongings. Kevin's effects remained untouched. His possessions were still on the ferry. His work items, his things from his quarters. There was nothing to suggest that he had tried to leave the ship intentionally. No indication of his attempting to disappear into another country. Everything pointed to a young man who should still have been on board when the vessel docked, and yet he was not. Witness interviews began immediately. The 30 or so statements collected from crew members painted the same picture. Kevin had been working in the galley, had left through the door, and had not returned. Beyond that, there was only speculation. Passengers were more difficult. Some could barely recall their interactions. Others confused details or offered fragments of memory that led nowhere. The challenge grew greater when authorities discovered that many travelers used 60-day identity cards rather than passports. Some passengers had disembarked before their identities could be properly recorded. The door through which Kevin walked had become the center of the investigation. One direction meant a brief detour and a swift return. The other carried him into open exposure, a place where any misstep could prove fatal. But which way he had gone, and what happened after, remained entirely unverified. By the end of that night, one thing was certain. Kevin Dundon had vanished somewhere between Zeebrugge and Felixstowe. The ferry had been searched, the waters had been combed, and yet he was gone. The question was no longer whether he was missing, but how a man surrounded by people on a working vessel could disappear without a single definitive trace. That uncertainty, sharper than any confirmed tragedy, is what transformed Kevin's case into something larger than a lost seaman. It was the beginning of a mystery that would haunt investigators and torment his family for decades. As the search pressed into its second week, what had initially been a straightforward missing persons case began to unravel into a web of contradictions. Each passing day without progress widened the gap between official reports and the fragments of testimony provided by those who last saw Kevin alive. The search radius, once tightly concentrated around the campsite, expanded outward into terrain that was both unforgiving and disorienting. Teams combed ridges, streambeds, and game trails. Aerial units swept overhead, equipped with thermal cameras to detect any trace of heat or movement. Yet, Kevin remained elusive, as though swallowed by the wilderness. One of the most confounding aspects was the absence of physical evidence. In similar cases, items belonging to the missing, jackets, tools, water bottles, often turned up, offering clues to their direction of travel. But Kevin left nothing behind. His camp, inspected meticulously, showed no signs of struggle or haste. His belongings were in order, his gear accounted for, his tent neatly packed. For investigators, this raised the question. Had he even left the camp on foot, or had something or someone intervened before he could? Witness statements only deepened the mystery. Several of Kevin's companions provided overlapping accounts. He had been last seen shortly after dawn, preparing to explore a nearby ridge. Some recalled him speaking casually about returning by mid-morning. Others were less certain, admitting they hadn't paid much attention to his exact words. These small discrepancies might seem trivial, but in the absence of hard evidence, they left room for speculation. Tension soon crept into the camp. Search coordinators pressed Kevin's companions for details, asking them to retrace every step of their time together. The men grew increasingly defensive, frustrated by insinuations that their stories did not align perfectly. The possibility that Kevin had become lost through his own misjudgment seemed at odds with his reputation. An experienced outdoorsman, familiar with the region's terrain and well-prepared for its challenges. If anyone knew how to navigate and survive in such conditions, it was him. Investigators also wrestled with timelines. The group had not reported Kevin missing immediately, assuming at first that he had simply wandered further afield. Hours were lost in this hesitation. By the time authorities were alerted, any tracks that might have existed had been obscured by shifting weather and the constant movement of searchers. A forest, once still, had become a maze of disturbed underbrush and trampled soil, erasing the very evidence they sought. The lack of leads opened the door for darker theories. Some speculated that Kevin may have encountered foul play. In remote areas, accidental violence or deliberate harm often went unnoticed, and without a body, the truth remained hidden beneath layers of conjecture. The strained atmosphere among his companions fueled whispers, if only privately, that perhaps not everyone in the camp had been forthcoming. Parallel to this, others entertained the possibility of an accident concealed by nature itself. A misstep on loose rock, a sudden fall into one of the area's many ravines, or a slip into a concealed waterway could have claimed him swiftly and completely. In such a scenario, his body might have been hidden in places that even the most exhaustive searches could not penetrate. Authorities faced pressure from all sides. Kevin's family demanded answers, the public followed developments with growing fascination, and search volunteers felt the weight of failure with every fruitless day. The case transitioned from a hopeful recovery effort to a grim investigation where each unanswered question seemed to multiply. As the official search wound down after weeks of exhaustive effort, uncertainty hardened into frustration. Reports were filed, theories circulated, but the absence of Kevin himself rendered all speculation hollow. What was left was a fractured picture. a man who had entered the wilderness with confidence and supplies, and who had vanished without leaving behind even the faintest imprint. When the official search was finally suspended, Kevin's case crossed the threshold from an active rescue mission into a long-term enigma. Families often dread this transition. It marks the point where hope of recovery gives way to the blunt reality of uncertainty. For Kevin,